The sound of a vacuum tube was something most prisoners of war could only remember from a life before barbed wire and rifle towers. But in a sweltering prison camp deep in the Pacific Theater, one such tube became the difference between blind hope and informed resistance. This is not a story about heroes storming beaches or generals moving armies across maps. This is about something far more dangerous, a secret that, if discovered, meant immediate execution. A whisper of defiance built from scraps, powered by desperation and hidden in the most unlikely of places. May 1942. Captain Russell Hutchison didn't look like a threat to the Imperial Japanese Army. Gaunt, malnourished, covered in tropical sores, he shuffled through the mud of Davao Penal Colony in the Philippines alongside hundreds of other American prisoners. They had surrendered after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, and now they worked 12-hour days cutting timber and hauling supplies for their captors. The guards called them weak cowards who had dishonored themselves by choosing life over death, but Hutchison possessed something the guards never suspected. Before the war, he had been a radio engineer, and in his mind, even as his body withered, circuits and frequencies still sparked with life. He watched everything. The commandant's office, where a personal Zenith radio sat on a desk, the machine shop, cluttered with broken equipment looted from American positions, the supply shed, where salvaged radios from Sears and Montgomery Ward gathered dust. Each broken device was a potential goldmine of components, tubes, capacitors, resistors, wire, everything needed to build something the Japanese had specifically forbidden under penalty of death. A receiver. The call came unexpectedly. The commandant needed someone who could repair radios. Hutchison's name was mentioned by another prisoner who knew his background. He was summoned to the commandant's quarters, his heart hammering. This was either an opportunity or a trap. The commandant gestured to the zenith on his desk. It crackled with static, refusing to tune properly. Hutchison examined it carefully, his hands trembling, not from fear but from barely suppressed excitement. He could fix this, and in doing so, he could gain access to the camp's collection of broken electronics. He worked slowly, deliberately, making the repair seem more complicated than it was. When the zenith finally sang with clear audio, the commandant was pleased. Other guards began bringing their looted radios. Each repair job gave Hutchison time in the machine shop, unsupervised for precious minutes. A tube socket here, a capacitor there. He hid components in his ragged clothing, secreted them back to the barracks under the noses of guards who saw only a compliant prisoner fixing their entertainment. But Hutchison knew what he was building wasn't entertainment, it was survival. In the barracks at night, Hutchison assembled his stolen treasure with surgical precision. He had 4 vacuum tubes, lifted from various sources over weeks of careful theft, a headset that had survived a fire, scorched but functional, capacitors and resistors salvaged from a car radio, even a voltage meter, smuggled piece by piece from the machine shop. But the real challenge wasn't just building a radio, it was hiding it. The Japanese conducted random searches, prisoners caught with contraband were beaten, sometimes executed. A functioning shortwave receiver was the ultimate contraband, evidence of espionage, grounds for immediate death. Hutchison solved this by concealing the radio inside a canteen, the mundane metal water container every prisoner carried. The components were miniaturized, crammed into impossible spaces. The headset was disguised as medical tubing. The antenna was a length of wire that looked like laundry line. He tested it for the first time in June 1942, hunched in the corner of the barracks after midnight, the headset pressed against his ear. Static, then faintly, impossibly a voice. English. An Allied broadcast from Australia. News of the war. Information the Japanese censored, destroyed. kept from the prisoners to maintain the illusion of inevitable Japanese victory. Hutchison's hands shook. He was holding hope, and hope, he realized, was more dangerous than any weapon. Word spread carefully through the camp, not openly, never openly, but prisoners with leadership roles were quietly informed. The senior POW officer, a colonel named, knew what this meant: real intelligence, morale, the ability to counter Japanese propaganda with facts, but he also knew the risk. If the radio was discovered, everyone involved would die. They established protocols. Only trusted men would listen. The radio would operate only at night when guards were fewer, and exhaustion made everyone less vigilant. News would be disseminated carefully, verbally, never written down, and the radio would move, never in the same place twice, hidden in latrines, buried in false-bottomed crates, concealed inside hollowed-out sections of the barracks themselves. For months it worked. Prisoners began receiving updates: the Battle of Midway, Allied victories in the Solomon Islands. Slowly, the narrative of Japanese invincibility began to crack. Men who had been suicidal with despair found reason to endure another day. They began to believe that the war could be won, that they might actually survive to see liberation. But information was a double-edged sword. In late 1942, the Japanese began noticing changes in prisoner behavior. Men were less compliant. Whispers of Allied victories circulated despite the complete absence of newspapers or official news. The commandant ordered increased searches. Guards became suspicious. Paranoia infected the camp. Hutchison knew the radio's days were numbered. Every use was a gamble, and the odds were narrowing. Then, in January 1943, disaster nearly struck. A guard stumbled into the barracks during a listening session. The operator barely had time to shove the headset into his shirt and kick the canteen under a sleeping mat before the guard entered with his rifle raised. He suspected something, but couldn't prove it. The prisoners were beaten anyway on principle, but the radio survived. Hutchison rebuilt it inside a new container, a medical kit this time, and moved the operation to a different barracks. The cat and mouse game continued. Across the Pacific, in a Japanese camp in Borneo, another prisoner was waging a similar war. Colonel R.G. Wells, a British radio engineer captured in 1942, faced even more primitive conditions than Hutchison. His camp had no machine shop, no looted American radios, no convenient source of electrical components. But Wells was a man who refused to accept impossibility as an answer. If he couldn't scavenge parts, he would invent them. He started with materials that seemed useless. Tea chest foil became capacitors. Your newspaper, hoarded and hidden, was cut into precise strips for insulation. String was soaked in burnt cinnamon bark to create resistors, the charcoal acting as a crude conductive element. Bare wire was insulated by rubbing stolen flour into palm oil and coating each strand, a process that took hours and left his fingers raw. For power, he constructed a chemical battery from potassium dichromate, stolen from the camp pharmacy, and zinc buttons pried from trouser flies. When that proved insufficient, he built a rectifier that could tap into the camp's AC electrical supply and drop the voltage to something a radio could use without electrocuting him. The only components Wells couldn't improvise were the vacuum tube and the headset. Those had to be acquired through bribery, traded for cigarettes and scraps of food that prisoners could barely afford to part with, but they got them because hope, Wells understood, was worth any cost. Wells's radio was a masterpiece of improvisation, a super heterodyne receiver built entirely from refuse and ingenuity. He hid it inside the camp latrine, the one place guards avoided unless absolutely necessary. The smell was unbearable, but it was also the safest location in the entire camp. At night, prisoners would take turns listening, crouched in the filth, the headset pressed against their ears, catching fragments of BBC broadcasts from London. Churchill's voice, reports of Allied landings, the truth, unfiltered and undeniable. They heard about D-Day before their captors did, listening to the reports on June 6, 1944, while Japanese guards patrolled outside, unaware that the war had just fundamentally shifted. Wells radio operated until the very end of the war. On May 8, 1945, prisoners in the Borneo camp listened to Churchill's announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender. They wept openly, not just from joy, but from the sheer relief of knowing that the world outside had not forgotten them, that the fight was not in vain, that liberation, however distant, was now inevitable. Back in the Philippines, Hutchison's radio had survived longer than anyone thought possible. By 1944, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign back across the Pacific, the information the radio provided became critical. Prisoners learned about approaching liberation forces, about timelines, about strategy. They began preparing quietly, stockpiling supplies, organizing resistance plans, ensuring that when American forces arrived, they would find survivors ready to act, not broken men waiting for rescue. But the Japanese were preparing too. As the war turned against them, camp conditions deteriorated, food rations were cut, brutality increased, guards became erratic, violent, unpredictable. The commandant ordered more frequent searches. Hutchison knew the end was near, one way or another. Either liberation would come, or the radio would be discovered, and everyone involved would be executed. The gamble had always been binary, survival or death. There was no middle ground. In September 1944, the radio was finally compromised, not through a search, but through betrayal. A prisoner, broken by torture, revealed its existence to the Japanese. Guards stormed the barracks. In the middle of the night, they found the canteen, they found the components, they found everything. Hutchison and 3 other men were dragged to the commandant's office. They were beaten, interrogated, tortured for names. The commandant demanded to know who else was involved, how long had the radio been operating, what information had been transmitted. Hutchison said nothing. Even as his ribs cracked under the guard's boots, even as blood filled his mouth, he remained silent because he knew that if he talked, dozens would die, and because he knew something the Japanese didn't. Liberation was close, closer than they realized. He just had to survive a little longer. The men were thrown into isolation cells. No food, no water, left to die slowly as an example to the rest of the camp. But the message had already spread. The radio was gone, but the information it had provided remained. The prisoners knew the Americans were coming. They could endure a little longer. October 1944, American forces landed in the Philippines. The Japanese began evacuating prisoners, moving them to Japan itself, cramming them into transport ships that became floating coffins, torpedoed by American submarines that didn't know they carried Allied POWs. Hutchison survived the transport barely. He arrived in Japan weighing less than 90 pounds, his body a catalogue of untreated injuries, but he was alive. And the war was ending. He could feel it. The guards felt it too. Discipline collapsed. Some guards became more brutal, taking out their rage on prisoners who represented their impending defeat. Others simply vanished, abandoning their posts, fleeing into the countryside as American bombers turned Japanese cities into infernos. In August 1945, Hutchison was in a camp near Tokyo when the atomic bombs fell. He didn't know what had happened, only that the guards had stopped coming, that the camp was suddenly, eerily silent. Then, on August 15th, a voice crackled over the camp's loudspeaker, Emperor Hirohito announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. Prisoners emerged from their barracks, skeletal figures shuffling into the sunlight. unsure if this was real or another cruel trick. American planes appeared overhead, dropping supplies, food, medicine, cigarettes, proof that liberation was not a dream. Russell Hutchison stood in the camp yard, watching the planes circle and thought about the radio, about the vacuum tube that had been the difference between despair and endurance, about the men who had died protecting that secret, about the whispers of hope that had kept them alive when everything else said they should give up. He returned to the United States in late 1945, a ghost of the man who had left. He never spoke publicly about the radio. It remained classified for decades, a footnote in the vast machinery of the war. But privately, among the survivors, the story was passed down. The canteen radio, the device that had defied an empire with nothing but stolen parts and stubborn refusal to accept silence. Years later, Hutchison's son found the notes his father had kept, schematics, component lists, a record of the impossible made real. He donated them to a museum where they remain, a testament to ingenuity born from desperation. The radio itself was destroyed in 1944, smashed by Japanese guards, but its legacy survived because it had never been just about the information. It had been about defiance, about the refusal to let the enemy control not just bodies, but minds, about the recognition that even in the darkest places where death was not just likely but expected, human beings could still fight back, not with weapons, but with knowledge, with truth, with whispers. Colonel R.G. Wells, the British engineer who built a radio from tea chest foil and cinnamon bark in Borneo, lived until 1998. He rarely discussed his time in the camps, but when pressed, he would describe the radio with quiet pride, not as an act of heroism, but as something more fundamental, a refusal to accept that the war was something happening elsewhere to other people. It was happening to them, and they had a right to know, to understand, to hope. The men who listened to those radios, who crouched in latrines and barracks with stolen headsets pressed against their ears, catching fragments of broadcasts from a world they thought they'd lost, carried those moments for the rest of their lives. They had heard the truth when lies were the only authorized communication. They had known liberation was coming when their captors insisted the war was lost. They had survived because information, that most fragile and powerful of weapons, had reached them through the static and the silence, delivered by men who risked everything to build receivers from nothing. The vacuum tube that changed the war in the Pacific was never credited in official histories. No medals were awarded for its construction. No generals wrote about it in their memoirs. But in the memories of the men who survived, it occupies a place of honor, a small glass cylinder glowing faintly in the darkness, carrying voices from impossibly far away, proof that even in captivity, even in camps designed to break human beings into obedient shells, the spark of resistance could not be extinguished. It could be hidden, disguised, buried in canteens and latrines and false-bottomed crates, but it could not be destroyed because that spark was not in the tube itself. It was in the men who built it, who listened to it, who protected it at the cost of their own lives. The radio was just metal and glass, but the will to create it, to use it, to preserve it against all odds, that was something the Japanese Empire, for all its military might, could never touch. That was the real weapon, and in the end, it was the one that mattered most.